in which the author looks forward to the general election, written during the last general election campaign. Another election, and the politicians are already excitedly tweeting pictures of their canvassing teams. It's certainly been a great few years for agoraphobic hostage takers. Where is David Cameron now? Probably with chaps from his year at school on an arms industry jolly, betting on which blindfolded tramp can successfully cross the surface of a frozen lake. I wonder when our politicians were last so completely divorced from the experience of the public. If you're a modern politician and your driver takes a wrong turn through a housing estate, it must be like when we drive through a safari park. Faster! That one in the tracksuit looks like he wants to shit through the sunroof! May called the election because of a lack of unity at Westminster, where there does tend to be a lack of unity, what with one of the major parties being called the opposition. May is, at least, openly calculating. Not taking part in TV debates is based on a lifetime of finding that getting to know her better tends not to make people like her more, combined with the idea that it will probably win her a few votes out of relief. Her main pitch, that it will strengthen her hand in Brexit, is patent nonsense, asking us to picture a world where EU negotiators are sitting around fretting over what it will mean if May secures a dozen new MPs in the potteries. Still, at least the political class seem to be enjoying themselves. Jeremy Corbyn is far happier campaigning, delivering rhetoric to people who already agree with him, than he is at Westminster, where he's about as welcome among MPs as a vigilante paedophile hunter. Theresa May seems as close to happy as she's going to get, and so far is evincing everything the British people seem to expect from a leader: religious levels of certainty and a sort of furious contempt for others. Even Nicola Sturgeon is smiling, as much as is possible for someone without lips. May will spend the campaign shamelessly playing to hand-picked crowds, standing behind her at engine parts manufacturers, their blank faces pressed into service as a living wallpaper. A place where a meek workforce has been pre-selected for ideological conformity is, in any case, her vision of the future. This kind of campaign is only possible with the collusion of the media. All it would take to puncture the whole thing would be a lone journalist shouting out, "Why are we in a bunker?" Or, "Isn't this toothpaste factory worker the junior Minister for Defence?" I suppose May's campaigning style comes from the combined hatred of the public and fear of improvising that have fuelled my own comedy career. During her whole premiership, May's only moment of spontaneity so far has been when she took time out to rant about having the word Easter in Easter egg hunts on a trip to Saudi Arabia, where it was hard to put your finger on the exact reason why chocolate eggs was not an appropriate topic of conversation, but possibly it's located somewhere in between the fact that we're helping the Saudis create a famine in Yemen and the fact that they behead Christians. May has surrounded herself with a cabinet whose physical forms seem to have been damaged in the journey from their own pitiless dimension. Where'd you get an inner circle like that? Possibly a Boys from Brazil style breeding programme, which began in 1945 in Berlin when some Russian captain had the presence of mind to kick Hitler's nuts out of the flames so he could use them to buy British citizenship. We're hearing a lot about strong and stable leadership. Strong and stable sounds like the Tinder profile of someone on the edge of a nervous breakdown. It's the mantra of a middle-aged woman who has just been given a disciplinary at work for hiding a rifle in the stationery cupboard. Somewhere right now, there is a man dropping his carpets into cash converters because he needs to buy heroin for his dog, which got addicted when it stood on a needle in the park. As he sits holding the outstretched paw of a bemused, twitching labradoodle, he notices his own reflection in the gradually heating spoon. He is mouthing the words, "strong and stable." What can I say about Liberal Democrat leader Tim Farron? He's still at that stage where neither half of that name tag is quite enough to ID him. He was accused of homophobia for dodging a question about whether he thought homosexuality was sinful. It's hard to associate homophobia with Jesus, one of the gayest characters in all of fiction. I mean, he hung out with lepers. Are we really to believe he'd be squeamish about seeing two men kissing? Is the Christian position that Jesus wouldn't have wanted to see a man with another man's cock in his hand unless it had fallen off? I urge you to ask Tim Farron that on the campaign trail. To be fair, I have no doubt that if Jesus were here, he would be doing exactly the same as Farron. giving a few talks to a dwindling group of supporters and then being ritually slaughtered by a tyrant. I actually think the Lib Dems will do relatively well, because imagining Tim Farron in coalition with Theresa may appeal to the British public's taste in sadomasochism. A hapless Christian with the air of a terminally ill Beano character, a feeble Private Pike pitted against a mirthless, fascistic Archon as cruel as winter, enmeshed, frustrated, and eventually destroyed by the Alliance, used by her as a kind of human dildo. Paul Nuttall has made an error of form. In politics, it's perfectly acceptable to be associated with multiple untruths, provided you restrict yourself to matters of policy. Strangely, the idea that disenfranchised white people represent some kind of homogenous electoral wedge seems to have been largely welcomed by people across the left. Perhaps, like their counterparts on the right, they have a nostalgia for an imagined past when getting what you wanted depended on convincing a moral majority out there somewhere who, if they ever thought about what such people were like, looked and talked just like them. The strangest thing about UKIP, I suppose, is that they make a nostalgic appeal for the loss of community values and social cohesion that actually still exist, although admittedly only in immigrant communities. The SNP has a fairly simple job: to try to make the highest point of pro-referendum sentiment coincide with the lowest point of a Brexit-fueled recession. In this, they are playing an average hand, averagely. There is a dearth of anything from the SNP that's radical or even hugely progressive. This is both because they recognise that a lot of the voters they'll need in a second referendum are very conservative, and because they aren't radical or progressive. Both the strength and weakness of the SNP is its lack of interest in cultural nationalism. This lets it set out independence as a pragmatic option rather than a sentimental appeal, and yet it feels like a good case could be made for independence based around shared identity. Scottish people come in all varieties of races, temperaments and religions, but scratch the surface and we're all the same. Total cunts. The Conservative Party represents the interests of capital. In the Victorian period, Capital was a book by Karl Marx which explained why our way of life was unsustainable. Today, Capital is a radio station where my daughter wants to listen to Sean Paul songs, so we both have to sit through adverts for dog food. But in many ways, the message remains the same. While Capital has changed in form from steam engines to hedge funds, its interests are broadly similar. A key one is to insulate itself from the demands of organised labour. The Labour Party was formed to represent the interests of mass labour movements that no longer exist. And it's not just that the movements or type of labour have changed, the interests of workers have changed too. Pretty much every development since the Labour Party was founded, mass transportation, automation, globalisation, has made the needs and desires of workers more sophisticated. And consumerism gives them a vested interest in their own destruction. It's very difficult to have 24-hour shops or Christmas Amazon deliveries with strong unions. There are still people who have a class consciousness, yes, but they're all Tories. Perhaps Labour's founding principle of solidarity, like its Blair-era preoccupation with society and culture, are simply failing to register in an atomised country increasingly concerned with individuality. All that needs to be said for how the whole call me comrade stuff has dated is that a chunk of the working class would seem to prefer some kind of race war. In the media, we have a constant push for a moderate Labour that would be more electable. The political positions of Labour moderates include support for nuclear weapons, bombing countries for no apparent reason, and massively overpaying private companies for public projects. There's no evidence that any of that improves electability. Ultimately, Labour will lose because people ask themselves who could lead if they were trapped on a desert island. They know that with May they'd be eating the wounded by nightfall, and suspect Corbyn would be leading a 2-hour discussion about whether coconuts have feelings. May is right to bore us with the phrase coalition of chaos. It rather nicely captures the mood of election-fatigued Britain, where people don't want lots of different competing ideas and would rather just have one very bad one. Tories are there to represent the interests of capital to the electorate. The interests of capital are completely at odds with those of the electorate, so conservatism is alive with internal contradictions. There's obviously a disconnect between avoiding inheritance tax and trashing the environment, for example. Equally, The Tories have to combine pandering to anti-migrant hostility with the fact our economy's fucked without them. No doubt Theresa May will find an elegant compromise, perhaps having migrant workers spend the nights bobbing in the shallows so they can shuffle up our beaches each morning before changing into dry work clothes that they keep buried among the dunes. The contradictions of our society are managed by having an elite class who have internalised them, often through attending public school and Oxbridge. Oxbridge is a compound term formed from the words obnoxious and privilege. What we often think of as the self-belief instilled by an elite education is really a kind of class exceptionalism, a belief that privilege is earned through talent and hard work, against all the available evidence. If you doubt this, simply ask even the most left-wing Oxbridge graduate what role they think their background played in their success. One of the problems with left-wing discourse in Britain is that it seeks to moralise to its opponents without ever considering what they really think. A corollary of having a Conservative Party dedicated to misrepresenting the world to its own electoral base is that they try not to be honest in public. So if you're trying to shame them about something like inequality, you should be aware that many of them think inequality is a good thing, that it provides strivers with both incentive and example. Moralising with such people is like giving your cancer a good telling off. Let's be honest, even before Britain delivers a landslide for the most right-wing government this side of the Suez crisis, even before Brexit begins, before May starts wielding her majority like the One Ring, things aren't great. We have a property ladder where the bottom rung is so high, most people's only chance of reaching it is by standing on the bodies of their dead parents. Internationally, the leader of the nominally free world is so mentally ill we're about a month away from not being allowed to make jokes about him anymore. He's leaving his Charlie Sheen phase and entering bald Brittany. In some senses, this election isn't even particularly relevant to a broader, grim picture of environmental chaos, nuclear brinkmanship, and the ascension of transnational corporations to their final form. Perhaps we don't even need to steer this ship. Our icebergs started melting long ago, and they're coming to find us. The easy thing would be to sign off with some joke about how the lack of celebrity deaths in 2017 will be balanced by an upswing in mass public suicides. But I think it's important to hope. In the place we're going to, the ability to nurture hope may be the key to survival. If we can say one thing about the dominant forces in our society, it's that they don't go out of their way to create hope. No think tanks sit around trying to come up with ways for the government to foster optimism. Benefit caps with rape clauses weren't drawn up to inspire us about the future. Generally, our elites are uneasy about dealing with people who think things might get better, and would rather we were afraid they might get worse. Forces of control would prefer that we were scared, and exaggerate fears of terrorism for the same reason some muggers have knives. Frightened people are more compliant. Authoritarians don't want you hoping, and they don't want you voting. You should vote purely because it's so actively discouraged. If you don't vote, you can't complain. And let's face it, what is more British than complaining? A walk to the local primary school and you're allowed to complain for 5 years. It's shocking that our turnout isn't nearer 100%. Still, I suppose it gives us something to moan about.